Fantastic Audio presents the collected stories of Arthur C. Clarke, 1937 to 1949. The Lion of Comarre and Other Stories. Read by Scott Brick, Maxwell Caulfield, Gabrielle DeCure, Harlan Ellison, Amanda Carr, Paul Mercier, Juliet Mills, Stefan Rudnicki, Don Schlossman, and Michael York. With a foreword by Sir Arthur C. Clarke.
To my indefatigable bibliographer, David Samuelson, my first attempts at fiction appeared in the Hewish magazine for autumn 1932. I was then on the editorial board of the school journal, which was presided over by our English master, Captain E.B. Mitford, to whom I later dedicated my collection, The 9 Billion Names of God. My contributions were letters purporting to be from old boys working in exotic environments which clearly had science fictional inspiration. But what is science fiction anyway? Attempts to define it will continue as long as people write PhD theses. Meanwhile, I'm content to accept Damon Knight's magisterial science fiction is what I point to and say, that's science fiction. Much blood has also been spilled on the carpet in attempts to distinguish between science fiction and fantasy. I've suggested an operation by mapping out possible futures, as well as a good many improbable ones. The science fiction writer does a great service to the community. He encourages in his readers flexibility of mind, readiness to accept, and even welcome change. In one word, adaptability. Perhaps no attribute is more important in this age. The dinosaurs disappeared because they could not adapt to their changing environment. We shall disappear if we cannot adapt to an environment that now contains spaceships, computers, and thermonuclear weapons. Nothing could be more ridiculous, therefore, than the accusation sometimes made against science fiction that it is escapist. That charge can indeed be made against much fantasy, but so what? There are times, this century has provided a more than ample supply, when some form of escapism is essential, and any art form that supplies it is not to be despised. And as C.S. Lewis, creator of both superb science fiction and fantasy, once remarked to me, who are the people most opposed to escapism? Jailers. C.P. Snow ended his famous essay, Science and Government, by stressing the vital importance of the gift of foresight. He pointed out that men often have wisdom without possessing foresight. Science fiction has done much to redress the balance. Even if its writers did not always possess wisdom, the best ones have certainly possessed foresight, and that is an even greater gift from the gods.
Travel by Wire. First published in Amateur Science Fiction Stories, December 1937. Collected in The Best of Arthur C. Clarke, 1937 to 1955.
Sir Arthur C. Clarke has stated, "Science fiction has always encouraged an enormous amount of amateur writing, and there have been literally thousands of duplicated, sometimes printed magazines put out by enthusiastic fans. The first stories I ever completed appeared in some of these magazines. If they do nothing else, they may serve as a kind of absolute zero from which my later writing may be calibrated. Travel by Wire,"
and to their complete consternation told them what the keyword was. That is the best of being in our line. You can always do what you like with the other people. The chemists on the next floor were our only serious rivals, but we generally came out on top. Yes, remember that time when they slipped some vile organic stuff into our lab through a hole in the ceiling? We had to work in respirators for a month, but we had our revenge later. Every night after the staff had left, we used to send a dose of mild cosmics into the lab and curdled all their beautiful precipitates, until one evening old Professor Hudson stayed behind and we nearly finished him off. But to get back to my story. We obtained another guinea pig, chloroformed it, and sent it through the transmitter. To our delight, it revived. We immediately had it killed and stuffed for the benefit of posterity. You can see it in the museum with the rest of our apparatus. But if we wanted to start a passenger service, this would never do. It would be too much like an operation to suit most people. However, by cutting down the transmitting time to a 10,000th of a second, and thus reducing the shock, we managed to send another guinea pig in full possession of its faculties. This one was also stuffed. The time had obviously come for one of us to try out the apparatus, but as we realized what a loss it would be to humanity should anything go wrong, we found a suitable victim in the person of Professor Kingston, who teaches Greek or something foolish on the 197th floor. We lured him into the transmitter with a copy of Homer, switched on the field, and by the row from the receiver we knew he'd arrived safely and in full possession of his faculties, such as they were. We would have liked to have had him stuffed as well, but it couldn't be arranged. After that we went through in turns, found the experience quite painless, and decided to put the device on the market. I expect you can remember the excitement there was when we first demonstrated our little toy to the press. Of course, we had the dickens of a job convincing them it wasn't a fake, and they didn't really believe it until they'd been through the transporter themselves. We drew the line, though, at Lord Rosscastle, who would have blown the fuses even if we could have got him into the transmitter. This demonstration gave us so much publicity that we had no trouble at all in forming a company. We bade a reluctant farewell to the Research Foundation, told the remaining scientists that perhaps one day we'd Oh no, I'm going by plane. I don't travel by wire. You see, I helped invent the thing. Rockets for me. Good night.
How We Went to Mars. First published in Amateur Science Fiction Stories, March 1938. Not previously collected in book form.
N.B. All characters in this story are entirely fictitious and only exist in the author's subconscious. The psychanalysts, please apply at the tradesman's entrance. It is with considerable trepidation that I now take up my pen to describe the incredible adventures that befell the members of the Snoring in the Hay Rocket Society in the winter of 1952. Although we would have preferred posterity to be our judge, the members of the society, of which I am proud to be president, secretary, and treasurer, feel that we cannot leave unanswered the accusations, nay, calumnies, made by envious rivals as to our integrity, sobriety, and even sanity. In this connection, I would like to take the opportunity of dealing with the fantastic statements regarding our achievements made in the Daily Drool by Professor Swivel and in the Weekly Washout by Dr. Sprocket. But unfortunately, space does not permit. In any case, I sincerely hope that no intelligent reader was deceived by these persons' vaporings. No doubt most of you will recollect the tremendous awakening of public interest in the science of rocketry caused by the celebrated case in 1941 of Rex versus British Rocket Society and its still more celebrated sequel, British Rocket Society versus Rex. The first case, which was started when a 5-ton rocket descended in the Houses of Parliament, upon Admiral Sir Horatio Froth-Frenzy, MP, KCB, HP, DT, after a most successful stratosphere flight, may be said to have resulted in a draw, thanks to the efforts of Sir Hattrick Pastings, KC, whom the BRS had managed to brief as a result of their success in selling lunar real estate at exorbitant prices. The appeal brought by the BRS against the restrictions of the 1940 Rocket Propulsion Act was an undoubted victory for the Society, as the explosion in court of a demonstration model removed all opposition and most of Temple Bar. Incidentally, it has recently been discovered after extensive work at once. After 10 minutes observation of the stars, followed by 5 hours intensive calculations on our specially lubricated multiple slide rules, I was able to announce to the relief of all present that we were 5,670,000 miles from the Earth, 365,000 miles above the ecliptic, travelling towards right ascension, 23 hours, 15 minutes, 37.07 seconds, declination 153 degrees, 17 feet, 36 inches. We had feared that we might have been moving towards, for example, RA 12 hours, 19 minutes, 7.3 seconds, dec 169 degrees, 15 feet, 17 inches, or even, if the worst had happened, RA 5 hours, 32 minutes, 59.9 seconds, dec 0 degrees, 0 feet, 0 inches. At least, we were doing this when we took our observations, but as we had moved several million miles in the meantime, we had to start all over again to find where we were now. After several trials, we succeeded in finding where we were only 2 hours before we found it, but in spite of the greatest efforts, we could not reduce the time taken in calculation to less than this value, so with this we had to be content. The Earth was between us and the Sun, which was why we could not see it. Since we were travelling in the direction of Mars, I suggested that we could continue on our present course and try to make a landing on the planet. I had grave doubts, in fact, as to whether there was anything else we could do. So for 2 days we cruised on towards the Red Planet, my companions relieving the tedium with dominoes, poker, and three-dimensional billiards, which of course can only be played in the absence of gravity. However, I had little time for these pursuits, as I had to keep constant check on the ship's position. In any case, I was completely fleeced on the first day, and was unable to obtain any credit from my grasping companions. All the time, Mars was slowly growing larger, and as we drew nearer and nearer, many were the speculations we made as to what we should find when we landed on the mysterious Red Planet. "One thing we can be certain of," remarked Isaac Gusbaum, our auditor, to me as we were looking through the ports at the world, now only a few million miles away, "we won't be met by a lot of old Johnnies with flowing robes and boards, who will address us in perfect English and give us the freedom of the city, as in so many science fiction stories. I'll bet our next year's deficit on that." Finally we began our braking maneuvers, and curved down towards the planet in a type of logarithmic spiral, whose first, second, and third more than this could we desire.
Retreat from Earth. First published in Amateur Science Fiction Stories, March 1938. Collected in The Best of Arthur C. Clarke, 1937 to 1955.
I suspect that my interest in these amazing creatures was triggered by Paul Ernst's The Raid on the Termites in Astounding Stories, June 1932.
A great many millions of years ago, when man was a dream of the distant future, the third ship to reach Earth in all history descended through the perpetual clouds onto what is now Africa, and the creatures it had carried across an unthinkable abyss of space looked out upon a world which would be a fit home for their weary race. But Earth was already inhabited by a great though dying people, and since both races were civilized in the true sense of the word, they did not go to war, but made a mutual agreement. For those who then ruled Earth had once ruled everywhere within the orbit of Pluto, had planned always for the future, and even at their end, they had prepared Earth for the race that was to come after them. And so, 40 million years after the last of the old ones had gone to his eternal rest, men began to rear their cities where once the architects of a greater race had flung their towers against the clouds. And in the long, echoing centuries before the birth of man, the aliens had not been idle, but had covered half the planet with their cities, filled with blind, fantastic slaves. And though man knew these cities, for they often caused him infinite trouble, yet he never suspected that all around him in the tropics, an older civilization than his was planning busily for the day when it would once again venture forth upon the seas of space to regain its lost inheritance. "Gentlemen," said the president of the council gravely, "I am sorry to say that we have received a severe setback in our plans to colonize the third planet. As you all know, we have for many years been working on that planet, unknown to its inhabitants, preparing for the day when we should take over complete control. We anticipated no resistance, for the people of 3 are at a very primitive level of development and possess no weapons which could harm us. Moreover, they are continually quarreling among themselves, owing to the extraordinary number of political groups or nations. I cannot say its life. I am confident that we can overcome the creature, for it, or others like it, still control the remaining billions of the race. I have just returned from Africa, and termites there are still organized as they have always been. On this excursion, I did not leave my ship, or even land. No, I believe I have incurred the enmity of an entire race, and I am taking no chances. Until I have an armored cruiser and a staff of expert biologists, I am leaving the termites strictly alone. Even then I shall not feel quite safe, for there may yet be more powerful intelligences on 3 than the one I encountered. That is a risk that we must take, for unless we can defeat these beings, Planet 3 will never be safe for our kind." The president cut off the record and turned to the waiting assembly. "You have heard Theton's report," he said. "I appreciate its importance and at once sent a heavy cruiser to 3. As soon as it arrived, Theton boarded and it left for the Pacific. That was 2 days ago. Since then, I have heard from neither Theton nor the cruiser. But I do know this. An hour after the ship left England, we picked up the radiations from her screen, and in a very few seconds, other disturbances, cosmics, ultracosmics, induction, and tremendous long-wave, low-quantum radiations, such as we have never used in battle, began to come through in ever-increasing quantities, and this lasted for nearly 3 minutes, when suddenly there came one titanic blast of energy, lasting for a fraction of a second, and then nothing. That final burst of power could have been caused by nothing less than the detonation of an entire atomic generating plant, and it must have jarred 3 to its core. Now, I have called this meeting to put the facts of the matter before you and to ask you to vote on the subject. Shall we abandon our plans for 3, or shall we send one of our most powerful super dreadnoughts to the planet? One ship could do as much as an entire section of the fleet in this matter, and would be safe in case, but I cannot imagine any power which could defeat such a ship as our Zorantar. Will you please register your votes in the usual way? It will be a great setback if we cannot colonize 3, but it is not the only planet in the system, though it is the fairest. There came the subdued clicks and a faint humming of motors as the councilors pressed their colored buttons, and on the television screen appeared the words, "For 967, against 233. "Very well. The Zaranda will leave at once for 3. This time we will follow her movements with the televisor, and then, if anything does go wrong, we shall at least obtain some idea of the weapons that this enemy uses." Hours later, The tremendous mass of the flagship of the Martian fleet dropped thunderously through the outer reaches of Earth's atmosphere toward the far-off waters of the Pacific. She fell in the heart of a tornado, for her captain was taking no chances, and the winds of the stratosphere were being annihilated by her flaming ray screens. But on a tiny island, far over the eastern horizon, the termites had been preparing for the attack they knew must come, and strange, fragile mechanisms had been erected by myriad blind and toiling insects. The great Martian warship was 200 miles away when her captain located the island in his televisor. His finger reached toward the button which would start the enormous ray generators, but swift as he was, the almost instant acting relays of the termite mind were far swifter, though in any case the outcome would have been the same. The great spherical screens did not flare even once as the enemy struck home. Their slim rapier of pure heat was driven by only a score of horsepower, while behind the shields of the warship were 1,000 million. But the feeble heat beam of the termites never passed through those screens. It reached out through hyperspace to gnaw at the very vitals of the ship. The Martians could not check an enemy who struck from within their defenses, an enemy to whom a sphere was no more a barrier than a hollow ring. The termite rulers, those alien beings from outer space, had kept their agreement with the old lords of Earth, and had saved man from the danger his ancestors had long ago foreseen. But the watching assembly knew only that the screens of the ship, which had been blazing fiercely one moment, had erupted in a hurricane of flame and a numbing concussion of sound, while for 1,000 miles around, fragments of white-hot metal were dropping from the heavens. Slowly, the president turned to face the council and whispered in a low, strained voice, "I think it had better be Planet 2, after all."
The Awakening, first published in Zenith, February 1942. Revised version published in Future, January 1952. Collected in The Best of Arthur C. Clarke, 1937 to 1955.
First published by Manchester fans Harry Turner and Marion Eady in their fanzine Zenith, and significantly revised for publication in Future in 1952.
The master wondered whether he would dream. That was the only thing he feared, for in a sleep that lasts no more than a night, dreams may come that can shatter the mind, and he was to sleep for 100 years. He remembered the day, still only a few months ago, when a frightened doctor had said, "Sir, your heart is failing. You have less than a year to live." He was not afraid of death, but the thought that it had come upon him in the full flower of his intellect, while his work was still half finished, filled him with a baffled fury. "And there is nothing you can do?" he asked. "No, sir. We have been working on artificial hearts for 100 years. In another century, perhaps it might be done." "Very well," he had replied coldly. "I shall wait another century. You will build me a place where my body will not be disturbed, and then you will put me to sleep by freezing or any other means. That, at least, I know you can do." He had watched the building of the tomb in a secret place above the snow line of Everest. Only the chosen few must know where the master was to sleep, for there were many millions in the world who would have sought out his body to destroy it. The secret would be preserved down the generations until the day when man's science had conquered the diseases of the heart. Then the master would be awakened from his sleep. He was still conscious when they laid him on the couch in the central chamber, though the drugs had already dimmed his senses. He heard them close the steel doors against their rubber gaskets, and even fancied he could hear the hiss of the pumps, which would withdraw the air from around him and replace it with sterile nitrogen. Then he slept, and in a little while the world forgot the master. He slept the 100 years, though rather before that time the discovery he had been awaiting was made. But no one awakened him, for the world had changed since his going, and now there were none who would have wished to see him return. His followers had died, and mysteriously the secret of his vow. Presently he was aware of sounds, faint clickings and scratchings all around him. For a moment he was puzzled. Then he realized that the surgeons must be putting their instruments away. He had not yet the strength to open his eyes, so he lay and waited, wondering. Would men have changed much? Would his name still be remembered among them? Perhaps it would be better if it were not, though he had feared the hatred of neither men nor nations. He had never known their love. Momentarily he wondered if any of his friends might have followed him, but he knew there would be none. When he opened his eyes, all the faces before him would be strange, yet he longed to see them, to read the expressions they would hold as he awakened from his sleep. Strength returned. He opened his eyes. The light was gentle, and he was not dazzled, but for a while everything was blurred and misty. He could distinguish figures standing round, but though they seemed strange, he could not see them clearly. Then the master's eyes came into focus, and as they brought their message to his mind, he screamed once, feebly, and died forever. For in the last moment of his life, as he saw what stood around him, he knew that the long war between man and insect was ended, and that man was not the victor.
Wacky. First published in The Fantast, July 1942. Collected in The Best of Arthur C. Clarke, 1937 to 1955.
Wacky was first published in The Fantast, edited by Aberdeen fan Douglas Webster, who had previously taken over the magazine from one Christopher Samuel Youde, better known to science fiction readers as John Christopher.
The telephone honked melodiously. He picked it up, and after a moment's hesitation asked, "Hello? Is that me?" The answer he had been fearing came back. "You, it is. Who are you?" He sighed. Argument was useless. Besides, he knew he was in the wrong. "All right," he said wearily. "You win." A sudden purple twinge of toothache nearly choked him for a moment, and he added hopelessly, "Don't forget to have that stopping seen to this afternoon." "Ouch! As if I would," growled the voice testily. There was a pause. "Well, what do you want me to do now?" he asked at last. The reply, though half expected, was chilling. "Do? It doesn't matter. You just aren't." "The amazing affair of the elastic-sided egg whisk," said the great detective, "would no doubt have remained unsolved to this very day, if by great misfortune it had ever occurred. The fact that it didn't, I count as one of my luckiest escapes." Those of us who possessed heads nodded in agreement. He paused to drain the sump of his hookah, then continued. "But even that fades into insignificance before the horrible tragedy that occurred in the house where the aspidistra ran amok. Fortunately, I was not born at the time. Otherwise, I should certainly have been one of the victims." We shuddered in assent. Some of us had been there. Some of us were still there. "Weren't you connected with a curious case of the camphorated kipper?" He coughed deprecatingly. "Intimately. I was the camphorated kipper." At this point, 2 men arrived to carry me back to the taxidermist's, so I cannot tell you any more." "Phew," said the man in the pink silk pyjamas. "I had a horrid dream last night." "Oh?" said the other, disinterestedly. "Yes, I thought that my wife had poisoned me for the insurance. It was so vivid, I was mighty glad when I woke up." "Indeed," said his companion politely. "And just where do you think you are right now?"
Loophole. First published in Astounding Science Fiction, April 1946. Collected in Expedition to Earth.
In the 1940s, SF did not flourish in England, and its spiritual home was still the United States. I sold my first stories to John W. Campbell of Astounding, later Analog, during the closing months of the war. While I was...
Sorry, I've had no time to contact you before. I'll be seeing you as soon as I get back to Earth. Gosh, Mars is a mess. Our coordinates were dead accurate, and the bombs materialized right over their cities, just as the Mount Wilson boys predicted. We're sending a lot of stuff back through the 2 small machines, but until the big transmitters materialized, we're rather restricted, and of course, none of us can return, so hurry up with it. I'm glad we can get to work on rockets again. I may be old-fashioned, but being squirted through space at the speed of light doesn't appeal to me. Yours in haste, Henry.
End of Side 2.
Reverie, a manifesto of sorts, published in New Worlds, autumn 1939, not previously collected in book form.
All the ideas in science fiction have been used up. How often we've heard this moan from editors, authors, and fans, any one of whom should know better. Even if it were true, which is the last thing it is, it would signify nothing. How long ago do you think the themes of ordinary mundane fiction were used up? Somewhere in the late Paleolithic, I should say. Which fact has made exactly no difference to the overwhelming outrush of modern masterpieces, for a shilling in the 3rd tray from the left. No. The existing material is sufficient to provide an infinite number of stories, each individual and each worth reading. Too much stress is laid on new ideas or thought variants, on novae. They are all very well in their way, and it's a way that leads to strange, delightful regions of fantasy, but at least as important are characterization and the ability to treat a commonplace theme in your own individual style. And for this reason, in spite of all his critics, I maintain that if any could equal Weinbaum, none could surpass him. If, in addition to its purely literary qualities, a story has a novel idea, so much the better. Notwithstanding the pessimists, there are a million themes that science fiction has never touched. Even in these days of deepening depression, a few really original plots still lighten our darkness. The Smile of the Sphinx was such a one. Going a good deal further back, we have The Human Termites. Perhaps the best of all its kind, before the honest things we do lie endless possibilities. So many things might happen and don't, but may someday. How odd it would be if someone to whom you were talking on the phone walked into the room and began a conversation with a colleague. Suppose that when you switched off the light last thing at night, you found that it had never been on anyway. And what a shock it would be if you woke up to find yourself fast asleep. It would be quite as unsettling as meeting oneself in the street. I have often wondered, too, what would happen if one adopted the extreme solipsist attitude and decided that nothing existed outside one's mind. An attempt to put such a theory into practice would be extremely interesting. Whether any forces at our command could affect a devoted adherent to this philosophy is doubtful. He could always stop thinking of us, and then we should be in a mess. At a generous estimate, there have been a dozen fantasy authors with original conceptions. Today, I can only think of 2, though the pages of Unknown may bring many more to light. The trouble with present-day science fiction, as with a good many other things, is that in striving after the bizarre, it misses the obvious. What it needs is not more imagination, or even less imagination. It is some imagination.
Rescue Party. First published in Astounding Science Fiction, May 1946. Collected in Reach for Tomorrow.
This story stems from a lost original, which also inspired History Lesson, 1949, although it would be difficult to find 2 more contrasting endings.
Who was to blame? For 3 days, Alvaron's thoughts had come back to that question, and still he had found no answer. A creature of a less civilized or a less sensitive race would never have let it torture his mind, and would have satisfied himself with the assurance that no one could be responsible for the working of fate. But Alvaron and his kind had been lords of the universe since the dawn of history, since that far distant age when the time barrier had been folded round the cosmos by the unknown powers that lay beyond the beginning. To them had been given all knowledge, and within infinite knowledge went infinite responsibility. If there were missing civilization, and he wondered if it would be wise to change course, he decided against it. 5 minutes later, he had his reward. Miles below lay a decapitated mountain, the whole of its summit sheared away by some tremendous feat of engineering. Rising out of the rock and straddling the artificial plateau was an intricate structure of metal girders supporting masses of machinery. Orostron brought his ship to a halt and spiraled down toward the mountain. The slight Doppler blur had now vanished, and the picture on the screen was clear-cut. The latticework was supporting some scores of great metal mirrors, pointing skyward at an angle of 45 degrees to the horizontal. They were slightly concave, and each had some complicated mechanism at its focus. There seemed something impressive and purposeful about the great array. Every mirror was aimed at precisely the same spot in the sky, or beyond. Orostron turned to his colleagues. "It looks like some kind of observatory to me," he said. "Have you ever seen anything like it before?" Clarke, a multi-tentacled tripedal creature from a globular cluster at the edge of the Milky Way, had a different theory. "That's communication equipment. Those reflectors are for focusing electromagnetic beams. I've seen the same kind of installation on 100 worlds before. It may even be the station that Kulath picked up, though that's rather unlikely, for the beams would be very narrow from mirrors that size." "That would explain why Rugon could detect no radiation before we landed," added Hansor II, one of the twin beings from the planet Thargon. Orostron did not agree at all. "If that is a radio station, it must be built for interplanetary communication. Look at the way the mirrors are pointed. I don't believe that a race which has only had radio for 2 centuries can have crossed space. It took my people 6,000 years to do it." "We managed it in 3, said Hansor II, mildly, speaking a few seconds ahead of his twin. Before the inevitable argument could develop, Clarke began to wave his tentacles with excitement. While the others had been talking, he had started the automatic monitor. "Here it is. Listen." He threw a switch, and the little room was filled with a raucous whining sound, continually changing in pitch, but nevertheless retaining certain characteristics that were difficult to define. The 4 explorers listened intently for a minute. Then Orostron said, "Surely that can't be any form of matter. The sun could never harm them now, and although the ship was speeding helplessly out into the lonely night of interstellar space, it would only be a matter of days before rescue came. There was irony in that. A day ago, they had been the rescuers, going to the aid of a race that now no longer existed. Not for the first time, Alvaron wondered about the world that had just perished. He tried in vain to picture it as it had been in its glory, the streets of its cities thronged with life. Primitive though its people had been, they might have offered much to the universe. If only they could have made contact. Regret was useless. Long before their coming, the people of this world must have buried themselves in its iron heart. And now, they and their civilization would remain a mystery for the rest of time. Alvaron was glad when his thoughts were interrupted by Rugon's entrance. The chief of communications had been very busy ever since the takeoff, trying to analyze the programs radiated by the transmitter Orostron had discovered. The problem was not a difficult one, but it demanded the construction of special equipment, and that had taken time. "Well, what have you found?" asked Alvaron. "Quite a lot," replied his friend. "There's something mysterious here, and I don't understand it. It didn't take long to find how the vision transmissions were built up, and we've been able to convert them to suit our own equipment. It seems that there were cameras all over the planet, surveying points of interest. Some of them were apparently in cities on the tops of very high buildings. The cameras were rotating continuously to give panoramic views. In the programs we've recorded, there are about 20 different scenes. In addition, there are a number of transmissions of a different kind, neither sound nor vision. They seem to be purely scientific, possibly instrument readings or something of that sort. All these programs were going out simultaneously on different frequency bands. Now there must be a reason for all this. Orostron still thinks that the station simply wasn't switched off when it was deserted, that these aren't the sort of programs such a station would normally radiate at all. It was certainly used for interplanetary relaying. Clarke was quite right there. So these people must have crossed space, since none of the other planets had any life at the time of the last survey. Don't you agree? Alvaron was following intently. Time? Remember, this is the youngest civilization in the universe. 400,000 years ago, it did not even exist. What will it be 1,000,000 years from now? An hour later, Orostron left the crippled mothership to make contact with the great fleet ahead. As the little torpedo disappeared among the stars, Alvaron turned to his friend and made a remark that Rugon was often to remember in the years ahead. "I wonder what they'll be like," he mused. "Will they be nothing but wonderful engineers with no art or philosophy? They're going to have such a surprise when Orostron reaches them. I expect it will be rather a blow to their pride. It's funny how all isolated races think they're the only people in the universe. But they should be grateful to us. We're going to save them a good many 100 years of travel." Alvaron glanced at the Milky Way, lying like a veil of silver mist across the vision screen. He waved toward it with a sweep of a tentacle that embraced the whole circle of the galaxy, from the central planets to the lonely suns of the rim. "You know," he said to Rugon, "I feel rather afraid of these people. Suppose they don't like our little federation." He waved once more toward the star clouds that lay massed across the screen, glowing with the light of their countless suns. "Something tells me they'll be very determined people," he added. "We had better be polite to them. After all, we only outnumber them about 1,000 million to 1. Rugon laughed at his captain's little joke. 20 years afterward, the remark didn't seem funny.
Inheritance. First published in New Worlds, No. 3, 1947, as by Charles Willis. Collected in Expedition to Earth.
As David said, when one falls on Africa from a height of 250 kilometers, a broken ankle may be an anticlimax, but is nonetheless painful. What hurt him most, he pretended, was the way we had all rushed out into the desert to see what had happened to the A-20, and had not come near him until hours later. We had never been to David's home before, and we were not looking forward to this visit. But it was the least we could do. As the mountains drifted beneath us, we talked about the suddenly darkened future, and wondered what the next step would be. Apart from the shock of personal loss, we were beginning to realize how much of David's confidence we had come to share ourselves, and now that confidence had been shattered. We wondered what Mavis would do, and discussed the boy's future. He must be 15 now, though I had not seen him for several years, and Jimmy had never met him at all. According to his father, he was going to be an architect, and already showed considerable promise. Mavis was quite calm and collected, though she seemed much older than when I had last met her. For a while we talked about business matters and the disposal of David's estate. I had never been an executor before, but tried to pretend that I knew all about it. We had just started to discuss the boy when we heard the front door open, and he came into the house. Mavis called to him, and his footsteps came slowly along the passage. We could tell that he did not want to meet us, and his eyes were still red when he entered the room. I had forgotten how much like his father he was, and I had a little gasp from Jimmy. "Hello, David," I said. But he did not look at me. He was staring at Jimmy, with that puzzled expression of a man who had seen someone before but cannot remember where. And quite suddenly, I knew that young David would never be an architect.
End of Side 4.
Technical error. First published in Fantasy, December 1946. Collected in Reach for Tomorrow.
As long as I can remember, I have been fascinated by the idea of the fourth dimension. In fact, my very first television program was devoted to the subject. 30 minutes live on black and white TV from Alexandra Palace in May 1950.
It was one of those accidents for which no one could be blamed. Richard Nelson had been in and out of the generator pit a dozen times, taking temperature readings to make sure that the unearthly chill of liquid helium was not seeping through the insulation. This was the first generator in the world to use the principle of superconductivity. The windings of the immense stator had been immersed in a helium bath, and the miles of wire now had a resistance too small to be measured by any means known to man. Nelson noted with satisfaction that the temperature had not fallen further than expected. The insulation was doing its work. It would be safe to lower. This time, the conditions must have been different in spite of all his care. There were so many unknown factors, and the theory was more than half guesswork. Nelson had not been inside the generator at the end of the experiment. But he would be. Dr. Hughes felt a cold sweat break out all over his body. He pictured that 1,000-ton cylinder spinning beneath the drive of its 50 million horsepower. Suppose something suddenly materialized in the space it already occupied. He leapt out of bed and grabbed the private phone to the power station. There was no time to lose. The rotor would have to be removed at once. Murdoch could argue later. Very gently, something caught the house by its foundations and rocked it to and fro, as a sleepy child may shake its rattle. Flakes of plaster came planing down from the ceiling. A network of cracks appeared as if by magic in the walls. The lights flickered, became suddenly brilliant, and faded out. Dr. Hughes threw back the curtain and looked toward the mountains. The power station was invisible beyond the foothills of Mount Perrin. but its site was clearly marked by the vast column of debris that was slowly rising against the bleak light of the dawn.
Castaway, first published in Fantasy, April 1947, as by Charles Willis, collected in The Best of Arthur C. Clarke, 1937 to 1955.
Walter H. Gillings, editor of Fantasy, was also the editor of Tales of Wonder, the first British SF magazine. More importantly, he gave me my first typewriter, which I carried home on a London bus from his home in Ilford. And he is the only editor I ever encountered who turned a story down, saying it was too good for him, and a rival editor would pay more.
Most of the matter in the universe is at temperatures so high that no chemical compounds can exist, and the atoms themselves are stripped of all but their inner electron screens. Only on those incredibly rare bodies known as planets can the familiar elements and their combinations exist, and, in all still rarer cases, give rise to the phenomenon known as life. From practically any astronomy book of the early 20th century.
The storm was still rising. He had long since ceased.
After the initial shock, Armstrong moved with commendable speed. He ran back to the Skytron, unlocked the controls with his master key, and made a series of swift adjustments. At once, the time base began to whirl round at a greatly increased speed, giving a more continuous picture than before. It was much clearer now. The bright nucleus was pulsating, and faint knots of light were moving slowly outward along the radiating filaments. As he stared, fascinated, Lindsay suddenly remembered a glimpse he had once of an amoeba under the microscope. Apparently, the same thought had occurred to the sub-lieutenant. It looks alive, he whispered incredulously. I know, said Lindsay. What do you think it is? The other hesitated for a while. I remember reading once that Appleton or someone had detected patches of ionization low down in the atmosphere. That's the only thing it can be. But its structure, how do you explain that? The other shrugged his shoulders. I can't, he said bluntly. It was vertically beneath them now, disappearing into the blind area at the center of the screen. While they were waiting for it to emerge again, they had another look at the ocean below. It was uncanny. There was still absolutely nothing to be seen. But the radar could not lie. Something must be there. It was fading fast when it reappeared a minute later, fading as if the full power of the radar transmitter had destroyed its cohesion, for the filaments were breaking up, and even as they watched, the 10-mile-long oval began to disintegrate. There was something awe-inspiring about the sight, and for some unfathomable reason Lindsay felt a surge of pity, as though he were witnessing the death of some gigantic beast. He shook his head angrily, but he could not get the thought out of his mind.
20 miles away, the last traces of ionization were dispersing to the winds. Soon I and radar screen alike saw only the unbroken waters of the Atlantic, rolling endlessly eastwards, as if no power could ever disturb them. And across the screen of the great indicator, 2 men stared speechlessly at one another, each afraid to guess what lay in the other's mind. The Fires Within. First published in Fantasy, August 1947, as by E.G. O'Brien. Collected in Reach for Tomorrow.
This, said Khan smugly, will interest you. Just take a look at it. He pushed across the file he had been reading, and for the nth time I decided to ask for his transfer, or, failing that, my own. What's it about? I said wearily. It's a long report from a Dr. Matthews to the Minister of Science. He waved it in front of me. Just read it. Without much enthusiasm, I began to go through the file. A few minutes later, I looked up and admitted grudgingly, "Maybe you're right, this time." I didn't speak again until I'd finished. "My dear Minister," the letter began, "as you requested, here is my special report on Professor Hancock's experiments, which have had such unexpected and extraordinary results. I have not had time to cast it into a more orthodox form, but am sending you the dictation just as it stands. Since you have many matters engaging your attention, perhaps I should briefly summarize our dealings with Professor Hancock. Until 1955, the professor held the Kelvin Chair of Electrical Engineering at Brendan University, from which he was granted indefinite leave of absence to carry out his researches. In these he was joined by the late Dr. Clayton, sometime chief geologist to the Ministry of Fuel and Power. Their joint research was financed by grants from the Paul Fund and the Royal Society. The professor hoped to develop sonar as a means of precise geological surveying. Sonar, as you will know, is the acoustic equivalent of radar, and although less familiar, is older by some millions of years, since bats use it very effectively to detect insects and obstacles at night. Professor Hancock intended to send high-powered supersonic pulses into the ground and to build up from their returning echoes an image of what lay beneath. The picture would be displayed on a cathode ray tube, and the whole system would be exactly analogous to the type of radar used in aircraft to show the ground through cloud. In 1957, the two scientists had achieved a partial success, but had exhausted their funds. Early in 1958, they applied directly to the government for a block grant. Dr. Clayton pointed out the immense value of a device which would enable us to take account. A most uncomfortable feeling had suddenly come over me. I thought of the thousands of miles of rock lying below the great city of Calastheon, growing hotter and denser all the way to the Earth's unknown core. And so I turned to Khan. "That isn't very funny," I said quietly. "It may be our turn next."
Nightfall. First published King's College Review, 1947. Collected in Reach for Tomorrow as The Curse.
Nightfall, also known as The Curse, was inspired by a visit to Shakespeare's grave at a time when I was stationed near Stratford-on-Avon, training RAF radar mechanics, living what would have been SF only a decade earlier, a juxtaposition which makes this story all the more poignant.
For 300 years, while its fame spread across the world, the little town had stood here at the river's bend. Time and change had touched it lightly. It had heard from afar both the coming of the Armada and the fall of the Third Reich, and all man's wars had passed it by. Now it was gone, as though it had never been. In a moment of time, the toil and treasure of centuries had been swept away. The vanished streets could still be traced as faint marks in the vitrified ground, but of the houses, nothing remained. Steel and concrete, plaster and ancient oak, it had mattered little at the end. In the moment of death, they had stood together, transfixed by the glare of the detonating bomb. Then, even before they could flash into fire, the blast waves had reached them, and they had ceased to be. Mile upon mile, the ravening hemisphere of flame had expanded over the level farmlands, and from its heart had risen the twisting totem pole that had haunted the minds of men for so long, and to such little purpose. The rocket had been a stray, one of the last ever to be fired. It was hard to say for what target it had been intended. Certainly not London. For London was no longer a military objective. London, indeed, was no longer anything at all. Long ago, the men whose duty it was had calculated that 3 of the hydrogen bombs would be sufficient for that rather small target. But many still bore the messages they had carried down the centuries in vain. The light died in the west, and the unnatural crimson faded from the sky. Yet still the graven words could clearly read, lit by a steady, unwavering radiance, too faint to be seen by day, but strong enough to banish night. The land was burning. For miles the glow of its radioactivity was reflected from the clouds. Through the glimmering landscape wound the dark ribbon of the steadily widening river, and as the waters submerged the land, that deadly glow continued unchanging in the depths. In a generation, perhaps, it would have faded from sight, but 100 years might pass before life could safely come this way again. Timidly the waters touched the worn gravestone that for more than 300 years had lain before the vanished altar. The church that had sheltered it so long had given it some protection at the last, and only a slight discoloration of the rock told of the fires that had passed this way. In the corpse light of the dying land, the archaic words could still be traced as the water rose around them, breaking at last in tiny ripples across the stone. Line by line, the epitaph upon which so many millions had gazed slipped beneath the conquering waters. For a little while the letters could still be faintly seen. Then they were gone forever. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. Undisturbed through all eternity, the poet could sleep in safety now. In the silence and darkness above his head, the Avon was seeking its new outlet to the sea.
End of Side 6.
History lesson. First published in Startling Stories, May 1949. Collected in Expedition to Earth as Expedition to Earth.
The second of 2 stories derived from an earlier one, now
To account for its behavior, but all this labor, all this research, would be utterly in vain. Perhaps the proud and lonely figure on the screen was smiling sardonically at the scientists who were starting their age-long, fruitless quest. Its secret would be safe as long as the universe endured, for no one now would ever read the lost language of Earth. Millions of times in the ages to come, those last few words would flash across the screen, and none could ever guess their meaning. A Walt Disney production.
Shakespearean Museum had just bought a first edition 7 Pillars of Wisdom. A few sheets later was a very contrasting item. Miscellaneous books, 25 kilos, no intrinsic value. It had cost a small fortune to ship those books to Venus, yet they were of no intrinsic value. Grant let his imagination loose on the problem. Perhaps someone who was leaving Earth forever was taking with him to a new world his most cherished treasures, the dozen or so volumes that above all others had most shaped his mind. Item 564, 12 reels film. That, of course, would be the Neronian super-epic While Rome Burns, which had left Earth just one jump ahead of the censor. Venus was waiting for it with considerable impatience. Medical supplies, 50 kilos. Case of cigars, 1 kilo. Precision instruments, 75 kilos. So it still seemed hard to believe that in such circumstances 2 men could have behaved in so reasonable, so unemotional a manner. He could have pictured all sorts of dramatic possibilities, sudden outbursts of insanity, even attempts at murder. Yet, according to McNeil, nothing at all had happened. It was too bad. McNeil was speaking again, as if to himself. Yes, Grant behaved very well. Very well indeed. It was a great pity. Then he seemed to lose himself in the ever-fresh, incomparable glory of the approaching planet. Not far beneath, and coming closer by kilometers every second, the snow-white crescent arms of Venus spanned more than half the sky. Down there were life and warmth and civilization and air. The future, which not long ago had seemed contracted to a point, had opened out again into all its unknown possibilities and wonders. But behind him, McNeil could sense the eyes of his rescuers, probing, questioning, yes, and condemning, too. All his life, he would hear whispers. Voices would be saying behind his back, "Isn't that the man who—" He did not care. For once in his life, at least, he had done something of which he could feel unashamed. Perhaps one day his own pitiless self-analysis would strip bare the motives behind his actions, would whisper in his ear, "Altruism? Don't be a fool. You did it to bolster up your own good opinion of yourself, so much more important than anyone else's." But the perverse, maddening voices, which all his life had made nothing seem worthwhile, were silent for the moment, and he felt content. He had reached the calm at the center of the hurricane. While it lasted, he would enjoy it to the full.